Namaste and welcome to the 17th talk by Vibha. And we are very happy, Hari and I are very happy to be part of this particular occasion. And though, of course, we will be talking about something that is a very, about the serious situation that is going around world over. But then this is a good time to pause and reflect on how an ancient civilization such as India, which has at least been living continuously for the last 8,000 years and more, has overcome such kind of problems that it would have encountered in all these thousands of years. So what did we do good to have stayed alive so long and quite well? We are doing pretty well, and how have we managed to come this far? So this is what got us thinking once the lockdown and everything started, and this is what we would like to share with you. So we have got a few slides that we would like to walk you through just to keep the flow going. We call this, in fact, we are bringing out a book itself, which is called Staying Alive, an Indian Perspective. Whenever there is some disaster or the other, there are three main things that people have to do. One is, first, anyway, how do you prevent such disasters from happening? Second, when they do occur, how can you contain the damage? And three, how do you come out of it? How do you cure yourself of the damages and bring back and restore yourself to a similar or even a better condition sometimes? So these are the three things that people have to do at all circumstances. And for overcoming such situations, in Indian thought, there is something which is very, very interesting, which we all must think about today, which is a concept of Ashwini twinning balance. This is a philosophical thought which is embedded in the Indian civilization, and that is to do with the Ashwini twins. Now, who are these Ashwini twins? Fundamentally, they are associated, they are the divinities who are associated with health, with Ayurveda, and they are called as a twinning key to good health.
And if you look at the definition for Ashwini twins, we have this very interesting definition which says Hita Ahara Mita Ayasa. Mita Ahara Hita Ayasa, meaning affordable food, appropriate exercise. Affordable exercise, appropriate food. It's an excellent balance, beautiful balance between food and exercise. That is a balance between food intake and the activities that we perform through the day. And it's a balance between not only activities but an overall holistic balance of life, where it's a balance between diet and lifestyle, balance between rest and work, balance between nourishment and treatment, and balance between prevention and cure. So life is all about a balance, and Ayurveda is all about a balance, and this is the balance that this particular definition and these divinities, Ashwini twins, bring out so beautifully to us. And if we look at Ayurveda, the system of medicine of Ayurveda, as the name says, Ayurveda, Ayur meaning life here, and Veda knowledge. So it's a knowledge of life. It's not just about medication, but overall knowledge of life, where it's got two-pronged focus, Ayurveda, and as any other form of medicine, one is called Swastha Vrita, which is about preventive medicine, health care, basically, and Atura Vrita, where it's some treatment of diseases, which could be better explained as medical care. So if you look at Ayurveda, the focus is a lot more on preventive health care, and nowadays we also use the word social medicine. The focus of Ayurveda is a lot on preventive care as a holistic health care for the individual, the family, and the community at large. Where, of course, Ayurveda certainly has got wonderful treatments once you have ailments, but the focus is a lot less in Athurvata, as it's more on Swasthavrata. So it's actually a balance between prevention and cure. In contrast, if you see the modern medicine systems, the focus is more of treatment after the illness hits you, as compared to taking precautionary measures before the illness hits you. So that's how the philosophical way to the personal healthcare system that's worked in traditional Indian thought to the modern world thought. So Swasthavrita obviously takes primacy both in terms of good times and in the present difficult times. But these present difficult times help us to recognize the value of Swasthavrita and go towards it more. And if you look at it, who gave us this idea of Swasthavrita? If you see it, it's all in Ayurveda. And the person who gave us all this wonderful treatise of Ayurveda is known as Charaka, and it comes from a treatise called Charaka Samhita. The name Charaka itself means it's not just one single individual, but a body of people across times, across the land. How do we say this? The word Charaka itself means Chalna, comes from the word Chalna, Charati, one who is walking. So it's a traveling doctors, traveling physicians who kept traveling all across the land, across times, across centuries, across millennia, right from Afghanistan in the northwest to Burma in the northeast to Kanyakumari and Sri Lanka in the south. So these are doctors who are traveling and explaining about good health, treating people all over the villages and towns, collecting medicines and herbs from the forest and treating people continuously and documenting illnesses across the land. And it is that composite documentation that has come down to us today as Charaka Samhita,
including research,
including wonderful forms of research.
Conferences,
They held
research.
Regularly it was held so that they could, all the Charakas could meet and then come up with their own findings across the land. This is done regularly. And actually, if you look at every Kumbh Mela or Pushkarni or Sangam that happens regularly at river beds at frequent intervals, these Charaka, apart from being a bathing ritual, all these Charakas also met there regularly so that they could, it's a place for them to come together, discuss and share each other's findings. So that is how the body of Ayurveda developed, kept on developing and kept up to times consistently. And it was not only about treatments that they said. The Charaka Samhita or all the Charakas spoke about food habits, good food habits, and also about hygiene habits. So these were all a composite part of Swasthavrita, that is a well-being. So it is all focused towards prevention.
Daily routines that you have to follow so that you don't fall ill.
So the keeping healthy aspects were there. And if you look, interestingly, look at the word for health in the Indian thought, it's called Arogya. The word Arogya itself comes from the root word Rog. Rog means disease. So Aroga, one to be without disease. So Arogya means freedom from disease, to be without disease. In English, you have this quite popular saying, health is wealth. But yeah, that's a nice saying, no doubt about it. But if you look at the saying in the Indian language, it's called as Arogyam Mahabhagyam. So good health or to be free from diseases is a great fortune. So we looked at it as a fortune.
And so it was not just, so when we talk about this twinning balance, one is how do you prevent, then you treat. So how much of thrust you should give. Likewise, when you have to treat also, the balance between something which is a poison and the balance between that which is a medicine. So even a poison becomes a medicine if it is properly administered, if it's properly prepared. And we see that even in the case of vaccines, because it's this very same antibodies that you have to make sure your body has even before the attack can come. So that is what you find as the what is not suitable sometimes when treated and handled the right way becomes a medicine. Both Sushruta and Charaka have spoken extensively about it. So this is again a balance. Not just that, even food and medicine, there is a balance. In Tamil, there is a saying, Marunde unavu, unave marundu. So when spices and herbs and other nutritional things become your food, then your food is as good as a medicine. It becomes a therapeutic. And there is a beautiful word which is called Beshajam, that which prevents you from falling ill, that which is very good for you. So thus, there has always been something about balance and having a holistic view. Because as we all know, to handle and manage a problem, the pains, when you actually undergo a problem, the effort and cost of that are much, much more as compared to the pains and effort and cost for preventing it. So you're in good health, you can prevent things, and even though you may have to do it daily, you may have to do it systematically, you may have to do it at all times, that effort and cost is far less than having to do it when you are ill. And so fundamentally, it is this twinning idea of avoiding crisis and managing crisis which has been the secret for staying alive. It is not only focusing on the crisis and managing, not just disaster management, but disaster prevention, which has been a greater thrust of the civilization. And they have done that by aligning with nature. Because fundamentally, if you see a lot of it, we live amidst nature. We are part of nature and we live amidst nature. So much of what we experience also comes from nature. So the more you're aligned with nature, the lesser you're going to find something being thrown back at you by nature. And also by building up proactive safeguards, capacity within you to meet these kind of crises if at all they occur. And at the same time, you did not neglect building proficiency to manage crisis. So you built proficiency. You did not only build proficiency, but you also have to build sufficiency. Because what is the point if I know how to do it, but I don't have things to be able to do it? So sufficiency is also important, proficiency is also important. And to arrive at this right balance, when should you give more thrust to what, is what able leadership is all about. And India has been fortunate that it has been able to have this good balanced view and balanced and able leadership across millennia to help us tide over so many such crises that we definitely our ancestors have faced in years before. But now, when there is a crisis, the question will be, okay, there is this famous Roman saying, quo vadis, where to from here? So where do we go when there is a crisis?
So now we are in a situation where you had lockdowns. Okay, we are in the midst of lockdown. These lockdowns could be from multiple perspectives.
If you look at it, we were talking about the crisis. There are two kinds. We spoke about natural, there is man-made. And people ask, is health related issue a man-made crisis or a natural disaster? If you look at what Ayurveda has been telling us, that you have to focus on preventive techniques, then you will find that health is a man-made crisis. It is arising because, epidemics, it is arising because you have not taken sufficient steps to prevent your body from getting attacked. There are means, there are ways, and you haven't done your work in looking after yourself. That is why you have become vulnerable to such attacks. So that way health, wars, protests, economy, pollution, these are all different kinds of man-made crises. And there are natural disasters which are very seasonal, sometimes like floods or droughts, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, or meteor hits, and so on. And fundamentally, when you look at these two kinds of problems that a civilization has to face, you find that during times of man-made crisis, people tend to by far and large, insulate themselves, meaning they withdraw into some protective shell, and that is what can help them. If there is a war, then you are better off staying somewhere in a protective place rather than going out into the open. But when there is a natural disaster, you cannot afford to stay in your own home ground, because that is what is under threat by floods and droughts and earthquakes. So you have to flee from there. And therefore, we call this as insulation through isolation and insurance through integration. Because when you have to flee, then you better insure yourself much before by being friendly with people around you, being open-minded and cultivating good relationships so that they can come and be of help to you at that time. They are willing to accept you, allow you to come and stay with them until you tide over the problem. And mind you, at that point in time, when you have to be friendly, at the same time, you also must be powerful and must be of value to the world. Because otherwise, why will they want to help you at all? So it is a good balance there again between friendliness and power, and learning how to be isolated and insulated as well as integrated with the world.
See, we know there are a varieties of lockdowns you have. One is a lockdown during war, sieges. That's happened through the times across the land. Repeatedly, wars and sieges have occurred. So people are held up in a fort for could be a week or a month or even a year or a few years. That's one side. And the other thing is epidemics like what we're facing now. This land has faced a lot of epidemics, especially in the last 1,000 years, and we'll see that as we go along. The other thing comes from protests. These are more violences and protests more from political or other aspects. Let's look at some of that. One of the natural calamities that occurred was about 5,100 years back in Brajbhumi when Bhagwan Krishna was there. So it was actually a 7-day lockdown. The Govardhanagiri episode for the region of Brajbhumi was a 7-day lockdown. If you look at this, is a famous popular painting of Krishna holding up the Govardhanagiri and keeping everybody under that as Sharanagati. That's one side. There's actual sculpture at Braj, and the third one, the bottom is at Mahapalipuram, south of Chennai. This is a famous rock cut in the cave temple there. So this is there. If you look at in forts, every fort was designed to face such sieges or lockdowns for long periods of time. That's why when it rains, they knew how to collect the rainwater in the fort itself, so they don't have shortage of water for long periods of time. Similarly, on the right you have the Kumbhalgarh fort. It's one of the largest forts of India. Incidentally, if you look at the wall, the ramparts of the fort, Kumbhalgarh fort, it's the second largest wall in the world after the Great Wall of China. Such a large fort. It was such a large fort walls. So the whole city lived inside this and safely lived for long periods of time. So it was well planned. They designed themselves to be secure for if they need to be locked down for long periods of time. And here is a notice in the Tamil language of the year 1942 when there was a blackout. And if you look at it, the word Bandh we use for lockdowns. One of the earliest bandhs in the modern world, about 100 years back, was against the Rowlatt Act that the British administration of India brought in. And it was Mahatma Gandhi then who brought in this concept of standstill, Bandh, so that everything comes to a standstill in India by people's voluntary effort. So it came as part of a Satyagraha movement, but bringing everything to a standstill. So that is something that India has used repeatedly many times. In Kashmir, unfortunately, for the last 70 years, due to various political reasons, lockdowns have been there, curfews have been there, bandhs have been there, probably 1,000 times or so. Fortunately, now things have been legally set right so that the state of Kashmir can look beyond all these bandhs and curfews, and now is an integral part of India to look at it holistically. Similarly, when you look at the Vanavasis, people who live in the forest, Vanavasi, Vasi, one who lives in Vana, forest. So one who lives in a forest is a Vanavasi. Unfortunately, in the English language, we use the word tribals for it. It's, in my opinion, not so nice word for Vanavasi, because Vanavasi itself is a nice honorific word for it. And these Vanavasis have practiced their own method of lockdown across times in different forests. Here we are showing an image of such a ritual practice of a voluntary lockdown that the Arunachal Pradeshis have practiced about, they had practiced about 40 years back, and they have now recently revived it where you have lockdowns. If you look at down south in the Nilgiris hills of the Western Ghats in Western Tamil Nadu, there is a place called Ooty, which in the local language is better pronounced as Udaga Mandalam. There you have the Toda tribals, the Vanavasi Todas. They have a very clear practice. If any among the Toda people go out of the forest, Vana, into a Grama or Nagara for any activity and then come back a few days later, they voluntarily keep themselves in a hut at the edge of the forest for a couple of days to ensure that they don't bring any of the diseases from the Grama or Nagara into their forest. So that was their way of isolation, which was a self-practiced isolation that they had. So this was a practice that they had so that they could ensure
quarantine, a form of their own form of quarantining themselves before they entered the Vanavasi settlement in the forest.
So that they ensure that the diseases they don't bring from the other habitations into their habitation.
So, therefore, if you look at it, when you encounter a crisis and you go into a lockdown mode, then what is very essential, which all of us are now today realizing, that it is essential to be self-sufficient. Because you may talk about a lockdown at a national level, or a state level, or a district level, or even at the level of a suburb that has been happening in today's situation. And what do you see? We see that we are we are feeling the pinch of having to be self-sufficient in terms of what? The essentials such as water, your foods, your goods, services, and skilled people, labor around to be able to deliver that to you in the case of a lockdown. So all of this become self-sufficiency aspect. The other aspect is when you have to be interdependent with other civilizations, then the factors that are important become knowledge sharing, technology sharing, because if you are looking at the aspect, the essence of self-sufficiency is that you don't depend on others for your vitals. What are essentials, you don't depend on others. So what is it that then you can exchange? It's predominantly in the form of knowledge, technology, learnings, motivation, inspiration, solidarity. These are the things that you need to be able to exchange in a interdependent mode. And the very word for self-sufficiency is svavritti. So svavritti, the root is vritra, which means like a cloud, sticking like a cloud. And therefore, whenever you take any fast, it is called vrat because you uphold, it is holding back, you contain yourself. So that is svavritti, that is self-containing, self-containment. And parasparashraya, you're depending on each other, mutual exchange for interdependency. So we have to practice both, and India had beautifully done this. We will see as we go by how we have been self-sufficient at the bottom grassroots level and how we have been interdependent with Krinvanto Vishwamaryam with the entire world. So globally we were very successful and had very good relationships, and at the same time at the grassroots level we were fairly independent and self-sufficient. And thus if you see actually in a lockdown we really need a lot of strength to go through such lockdowns, and you can get that strength only if you are self-sufficient. At the same time, when you are going to come out of lockdown, then you need strength again to be able to overcome all those gaps, all those things that you could not achieve during the lockdown, and how to climb almost double the level after the lockdown. And when you climb, what do? You have to build self-sufficiency again, because you may have exhausted all that you had built up, and you may have to build all those reserves once again so that you're always prepared. So preparing oneself purposefully is an essence of staying alive, and it really matters. It is very much like this butterfly, which eats and goes into the cocoon as a pupa, and then inside molds and grows, and then finally emerges out as a butterfly.
Beautiful butterfly. And this important aspect is for all this planning, leadership, and guiding people, there are three things. Here we, in this book, Staying Alive, we term it as PMG. These are three leaders. Let's look at what this PMG is all about.
The Indian civilization, if you look at all the legends across different eras, you will find that we have always spoken about three kinds of leaders. They may have had different names, they may have lived in different times, they may have been known for different achievements, but then they were predominantly three forms of leaders, and they are the forms of Prajapati, or a Manu, or a Guru. And Prajapati, Pati means the one who cares for, who protects, and Praja, so the people. So one who looks after his people, who leads his people, who helps to form the civilization, who teaches them the art of occupations and how do you succeed in life. So that is a Prajapati. Now Manu has been one who has led humanity. So if you look at it, Manu, his scope is much larger, and he is typically the one associated with having led people out of crisis. And finally, you come to Guru, whose scope is even larger. He looks at the Dharma itself, the cosmic Dharma, and how people should align with this Dharma. So he uplifts everybody to align with this Dharma. And a very beautiful example for Prajapati. There are various accounts of who all were the different Prajapati across times. But one of the names which is very lingering in all our minds is Daksha Prajapati. And the word Daksha itself shares its root with the English word dexterous, which means skilled. Dexterity. So, true to the role of a Prajapati, these kind of people, Khanda Rishi. So, even today, during Nariyal Purnima, people do tarpan to this Khanda Rishi because everybody trace their skills and lineage and their education to this particular Rishi.
Incidentally, if you look at Daksha Prajapati, it is Daksha Prajapati's daughter, Dakshayani, who goes on to marry Shiva and becomes Parvati. So this comes from a time-honored, hoary concept of the civilization, and we have a different Prajapatis at different times. People leaders, each have been people leaders basically.
The Prajapati Prithu, if you see, he is associated with having shown people how to harness the resources of earth in a sustainable manner. So, I mean, this is like talking about it in the modern lingo. If you look at the ancient legends, they talk about it as a beautiful story and what happened before his times and what did he do. And thus, after his times, how people and earth, they lived very harmoniously together. Which is why earth is also called Prithvi after King Prithu.
And now here we come to Manu. Look at the word Manu. The word Manu itself lends its name to the word man, mankind, humans, and all that, manual, everything. And across the world, you got different types of Manu.
And this word Manu, man, it comes from the root manam, manas, because it is all to do with mind, and we all know how it is mankind who is highly influenced with mind.
And across the world, we have had many a Manu. In Egypt, we have had Menes. In Egypt, across the Red Sea, you had Moses, Musa, Moshe. Noah is also a Manu. So, different Manus across the world in different forms. And all these people are leaders of the human race as a whole, not just of a land or a country, of the human race as a whole. And if we look at the concept of, in our time frame, you use the word Manvantara. Let's look at the word Manvantara. Yes, it's a cosmological time frame, goes into thousands and thousands of years, but it's also got another interesting meaning here in the concept of Manu. That's Antara, the gap between any two Manu is the Manvantara. So you have one Manu who gives you ideas, codes of living, and you all live with it based on the needs of those times. And after another calamity or another change occurs, another Manu comes up who gives us fresh codes to live by for the new world. So like that we have different Manus across times. So that's it. And let us talk Guru.
And the word Guru, the root is the word gur, which means to lift, to pull up or uplift, if you will. And it forms the root for also the word Gurutva Akarshana, which is the Indian word for gravity. And this was discussed much before gravity was explained in Western. Concept of gravity was explained in Western science. And thus, Guru denotes something that is heavy, that also has a tendency to pull, attract. And that is because they are full of wisdom and benevolence, and they draw people towards themselves and educate them on how to live in harmony with Dharma and the cosmos itself.
So our Prime Minister, when he spoke recently, he used a beautiful shloka from Valmiki Ramayana, from Kishkita Kanda, where he spoke about the importance of enthusiasm. It is these PMG, Prajapati, Manu and Guru, these are the leaders who give a feeling of enthusiasm in the difficult times of the people. That's one of the key functions, roles, to keep the people enthusiastic in difficult times. Hope is another factor. Hope is far off. You hope that something happens. Whereas in enthusiasm, you do things yourself. It's a self-developed enthusiasm, but it is induced to us by these PMG leaders, Prajapati, Manu, and a Guru. So it is these people, it's a good leader who enthuses us people to rise to the occasion and achieve things that's possible. It's a good leader who prevents dejection from setting in. It's a good leader who keeps the spirits alive. It's a good leader who lights the path forward. And it's a good leader who leads the way by self-action. So in India, we have consistently been fortunate to have all the three repeatedly at different parts of our civilization, Prajapati, Manu, and a series of gurus. That way this land has been fortunate.
So therefore, if you come to the bottom of the question, what do you do when there is a crisis? The first thing we have to do is look for these three leaders in our own civilization or our own times in our own society, listen to their advice and loyally follow their orders. Now, because there's another aspect to it, every crisis also heralds a change. So after the crisis, there has to be a change. And every change is typically accompanied by a give and a take. And very interestingly, in Indian thought, such kind of evolution is called, which is just nothing but continuous change, it is called parinama. Parinama automatically means the effect. So in our civilization, we have always looked at everything as a cycle of, or cycles of causes and effects. So when there has been a cause of some crisis or the other, and there has been a crisis as an effect, the effect of the crisis itself will be a cause, and the effect of it is what will happen, and it will definitely be a change, and one can hope and be enthused to march towards better days with the change.
And when we come out of such a depression, be it economy or be it human health or be it of civilization issues or societal issues, what do we look for? We look for rejuvenation. It's a very important aspect. How do you rejuvenate yourself?
See, when there is a crisis, there is another aspect that we have always associated with crisis. So we have seen the word that we often use is pralaya. So we look at ends as pralaya. But sadly, we always think of only the end of the world as pralaya. But if you go and analyze the word pralaya, the one half of the word means laya, layam. Layam means to blend, to merge, to melt, to dissolve into, which is why, when you listen to a music and blend with the music and its rhythm, then you say that you are in layam with the song.
With the flow of music.
So, but and pralaya is a special form of blending.
Pra here means special.
But there are 4 kinds of pralaya at least. One is nitya pralaya, meaning this is something that happens every day. And this is associated with what happens when we go to bed every night. It is how when we sleep at night, we are lost to the world. We blend into a different dimension of consciousness. Then another pralaya is a naimitika pralaya, which are caused by special events as eclipses or earthquakes. Then avantara pralaya, which means they are seasonal. So the season itself, change of a season itself is like a pralaya. One season ends and blends into the next season. And finally you have mahapralayas, which are large scale dissolutions at cosmic levels, which we often tend to think of. But if you see, each of these pralayas also cause rejuvenation. So in the nitya pralaya, when you wake up in the morning, you're very fresh, you have fresh cells, you have fresh blood, and on the whole there is a feeling of freshness. And in a naimitika pralaya, you have a new cycle of the moon. Sometimes you have new landforms. If there has been a volcanic eruption in the sea, you will find the next day there is an island over there. Similarly, avantara pralaya, you have a new season, new produce coming up. And even in mahapralaya, if a star dies, another star is born. So thus something, when there is a change, it blends and dissolves to give rise to something new. So what we have always known is that in Indian thought, everything is a cycle. So we have lived to accept things as cycles. Things go down and they come up. Now, you have falling down is not wrong, but if you don't take the steps to climb back again, that is when it is wrong. So there are proven rejuvenators that we had identified to help us climb back whenever things went wrong for us. And there
Let us
are
look at some of these very interesting rejuvenators. These are factors of rejuvenation. For example, if you look at an economy, gold is an important rejuvenator because your currency forms will change, various things will happen, different lands have a different currency, different times have a different currency, but gold consistently has been a rejuvenator for the economy. That's why people kept gold in their houses. They even buried gold for the next few generations. That's how it was. And grains is rejuvenator because it's a seed. That's why they kept these grains in times of calamity or before calamity strikes in the temple Gopuram because it's a higher level. So they did that. So you can restart life after calamity. Similarly, if you look at environment, water bodies are rejuvenators because they help you restart life. Forest is a rejuvenator because they are topographical barriers. They arrest the spread of various things and they help rejuvenate life again. That's why if you see now during this lockdown, from the forest, a lot of animals are walking into the roads, into the towns, be it a penguin in South Africa or be it bears in the Tirumala hills in Tirupati or different parts of India, or the flamingos coming to Mumbai Creek. So these are sort of rejuvenators that bring environment back together. Similarly for the body, our human body.
because it is forests that one can turn to for immediate produce after a crisis. Before you can again get back your agricultural cycles and so on, it is a forest that can be a nourisher and a provider and help you tide over that crisis.
And look at our health, our body. Ayurveda is certainly a rejuvenator because it looks at a holistic perspective from the Swastavrita perspective more. And for the mind, which is very important, dhyana, meditation is a big rejuvenator. And for both put together, yoga is a collective rejuvenator for life itself. And if you look at the perspective of knowledge and progress, those are again rejuvenating factors.
Because when you have a crisis or a disaster hits you, it is typically the modern knowledge, the more recently acquired knowledge, which is also very nichely held because it is fairly new, fairly nascent, hasn't spread around enough, and is fairly complex to that particular generation, which is likely to get lost or which is likely to not be accessible during that particular disaster or at the time you want to rejuvenate. But what holds good at that time is traditional knowledge. So this traditional knowledge which has been coming across generations, you will find it spread far and wide and available at every home itself. So it is these kind of knowledge systems, the traditional knowledge bits that can help you tide over crisis, that can help rejuvenate when you want to climb back again. So it's very important that we hold on to traditional knowledge and ensure however much we do progress in a modern fashion, because what is modern is going to become tradition over the next few generations. So knowledge that we hold on to it, as much old as it is also, we continue to hold on and keep passing it on to generations forward. And finally, for the human race, the concept idea of dharma itself is a rejuvenator. The idea that there is this overarching principle by which we have to live, and a principle which translates into good practices which are achar, good thoughts which are vichar, and desachar which has to be practices that are in resonance with your local conditions.
With your topography, with your local resources, with your local people. So it's a local rejuvenation. And that is what actually gives you self-sufficiency. It is these two. So it's a collective practice. So the achar is actually good practices. And desachar is local practices, local needs, local support. And understanding this is the vichar. So these three actually, and they all dovetail beautifully into the overall, as she said, overarching umbrella, overarching tree, vriksha of dharma. And that is what actually gives you the self-sufficiency and balance. It's actually a balance between self-sufficiency and interconnectedness. So that is what actually makes the overall thing, where we spoke about earlier about ATB, the Ashwini twinning balance. So it's again, we speak about here as balance between self-sufficiency and interconnectedness. That's what brings about the rejuvenating factor. And going on to self-sufficiency, is a very interesting aspect. Earlier she spoke about swavritti, where it is a self that holds together to make it happen. If you look at the Indian civilization as a whole, for across times, across the land, across centuries and millennia, it's been a very decentralized land. That is a native Indian model of administration where the local produce was consumed locally, the local taxes were utilized locally, and people managed their lives locally, be it in the panchayat system, whatever it is. Whereas when the English took over, the British took over administration of India, for them in their small island, it was a centralized form of administration. So they imposed that centralized form of administration on India, where they collected everything and took it to a central pool, and from there few people sitting there decided what needs to be sent down. So in this collection disbursement process, there were layers built, and these layers actually caused a lot of losses as well. And because for the British administrators then, collecting of taxes was their primary goal, their primary role. That is why even now in India, the district administrator is called collector, because that's a very colonial term, because the idea is to collect taxes, to collect money, to collect and keep. So the Indian concept, very important in Swavritti, is to be self-contained, contentment and self-containment. So that
and for that self-containment, you need to be able to generate your own wealth and be able to deploy your wealth the way you find it suitable for your local conditions.
And this Swavritti has got a beautiful balance between Swavritti and Parashraya. So,
but now the question will be, does India, we have spoken that it used to be decentralized, now we are in a centralized model, but do we have enough in us to be self-sufficient? Now if you look at it, the rain, fundamentally one of the most essential for all the other essentials is water. And the rains in India are sufficient.
if you look at the world map where we are shown there different parts of the thing, Indian subcontinent gets one of the highest rainfall in the world year on year. Actually, India gets the second highest rainfall after Brazil for a similar landmass because of the Amazon rainforest you get there. Otherwise, it's all Indian subcontinent that gets the rain. If you look at India, how many villages does it have? The postcode is 6 lakhs, so we have about 6 lakh villages. But if you look at the water bodies, the water harnessing bodies that the Indians have built over the last 5,000 years for themselves, it is 9,50,000 plus bodies. That means what? For every 2 villages, you have 3 water bodies. So the Indians recognized and realized that for their prosperity, for their sustenance, they need more water bodies and habitation. That is why India had these water bodies and they had harnessing systems. Unfortunately, over the last so many years, in the name of development and modernization, we have lost the maintenance of these water bodies, which you have to get back now. So what is this? It's a 3 things that is shown here beautifully.
So besides water, what else do you need to be self-sufficient, to be able to produce foods, goods, services? You need sunshine all over and through the year, which is available in plenty in India.
So India is a sunshine land.
You need sufficient number of people to be able to work
Skill.
with the sunshine, the local natural resources that each and every region has in abundance. And you have enough of those skillable manpower also. So fundamentally, if you see, we have all the nuts and bolts that it takes to be self-sufficient. What we need is to be able to put them together and screw them properly, tightly.
And work towards it.
And work towards actually being self-sufficient.
And here is a wonderful quote, this is about 200 years back, given by Charles Metcalfe, who says this: the village communities, that's the panchayats, were in those days republics themselves, having everything with them. And it is they who lasted, where nothing else lasts, because dynasties come and go, but the village communities remain. In times of trouble, they all, as she said, they all go inside. And then after the trouble passes, they again spread out and then do it. Or if a trouble is attacked at them, they go elsewhere and take shelter in some other place and then come back later. So it is these village communities, what in India we call as panchayats, that were the fundamental bedrock of the civilization that kept us staying alive across times, in good times and in bad times. And that's what here he says, Charles Metcalfe.
You see it even better in this statement that he says. He further says that in 1832 at the House of Commons, he says that this union of village communities, each one forming a separate little estate in itself, has, I concede, contributed more than any other cause to the preservation of the people of India through all the revolutions and changes which they have suffered, and is in a high degree conductive to their happiness and to the enjoyment of a great portion of freedom and independence. So he is saying that it is such a union, or this structure of their villages and the independence that they had, which has contributed to the preservation of the people of India through all that they have suffered over all the thousands of years, millennia, different millennia.
So here is one more observation by Bishop Caldwell, who makes a very similar observation, but he makes it specifically in the deep south area of the Tirunelveli district specifically, where he writes in the district manual. And the Chennai Corporation is in a building called Ripon Building, its house there. It's named so because of Lord Ripon, where he also writes in a similar year about the same thing as to how these village communities were little republics and lasted.
So fundamentally, if you see, for the way self-sufficiency is organized is at the lowest grassroots level, which is the physical grassroots body, that has to be physically strong and self-sufficient. So self-sufficiency has to be a physically observable trait, practiced trait at the grassroots, and that when they get aggregated at the top, they become a strategically powerful central. So this was the model beautifully that India had been following to become, to be a self-sufficient civilization itself as a whole.
And look at this, these are three key words we have in the development of a nation, of a civilization, of a community. Three words are Swarajya, Swatantra and Swavritti. What do these three words mean? Swarajya, self-rule. India got its freedom for self-rule in 1947 from the British. So we are ruling ourselves. That's self-rule. What is Swatantra? Swatantra means tantra, techniques, swa, self. So applying your indigenous techniques and indigenous wisdom to use for yourself. What's happened is, unfortunately, in the last 70 years, for various reasons, India adopted a very alien and a defective model called socialism onto India, which did not fit into the Indian ethos at all. So we did not have Swatantra for the last 70 years. It is only now we are realizing that the model was a failed model and an alien model and a defective model, and we are looking towards applying our own models to ourselves in New India to develop a better India. In this comes the concept of Swavritti, where you meet your own needs. It's only when you have self-rule and you have applications that are your own indigenous methods, then you can meet your own needs. So that's when you get self-sufficiency. It's in all the goods, from water to food to goods to skill to service, knowledge, technology, management, everything. You'll be self-sufficient to meet your own needs. That is important for civilization to be strong.
Because we saw that there were these small village republics, the panchayats, who were independent, and we all talk about the panchayat in the form of a local self-governing body. But what is their aim of governance? Is it just to be a political entity? And are we just talking about administering? But administer what? Without a particular goal, this administrative body will be just an empty shell. So what is that particular goal that used to drive such panchayats? It was nothing but self-sufficiency. It was to make that village prosperous, self-contained, self-sufficient, and therefore the people of the village happy amongst themselves without having to depend on somebody else for their wants, needs and happiness. So these panchayats and janapada were the aspect, or they were the dharma of the Indian civilization from Vedic times. So if you fundamentally again look at it, there is this twinning balance that is needed between what is traditional, because you are going to evolve. So what is traditional versus what is modern? What of modern will become traditional again? What is ancient? What is recent? What is proven? What is pioneering? Because you have to move forward, so you have to be pioneering as well. What is stagnation? What are things from the old that holds you back? And what is evolution? So you have to fundamentally balance both, but balance them aligned with nature, aligned with harmony, aligned with sustainability. So again, if you look at it, it will be a balance between what is called mental, what is called sentimental. What do you call just containment? What do you call as contentment? Can you be contained and content, or be contained but not content still? Survival and sustenance. So there is a fine line between both of this, and we have to make sure that we can see that line, discern that line, and cross over where necessary.
And if you look at this code of principle of the guiding principle of Dharma, the code of Dharma, many people have spoken about Dharma because it should not be seen as limited only to the English word righteousness. It's a lot much overall character. Actually, the word Dharma itself means character of a person, of an individual, of a body. The earth also has got its Dharma, the sun has its Dharma, the tiger has its Dharma, the goat has its Dharma. Everybody has a Dharma, the humans have the Dharma. And this Dharma is very, very hierarchical. And when you say hierarchical, Bhishma, when he was lying in his bed of arrows at the end of the Kurukshetra war, he explains every day evening, apart from saying the Vishnu Sahasranamam every day evening, he also gives these codes. And here he explains as to how one has to give up his individual needs for the sake of the family, and the family has to give up its individual needs for the sake of the community, the village, which in turn has to give it up for the sake, give up its needs for the sake of the humanity as a whole, and the community as a whole. The community has to give it up for the whole world, for worldly needs and for the soul. So it's very hierarchical. It's beautifully explained. So these are the guiding principles by which you have to staying alive, which the civilization has done for the last 5,000 years and more, and very successfully at that.
Because fundamentally, if you look at it, there is both man and there is virus in the environment. And now, who is a virus? There is a very interesting take that we have.
I'll tell you. So what happens is, what does a virus do actually? Virus propagates itself extensively, but in a very limited area, and it's very intensive. It consumes the resources of that area where it lives in a very intensive manner, to the extent it destroys the environment it lives in. That's what a virus basically does.
Environment meaning the human or the plant or animal
wherever it lives,
that it has
infected, or where it's decided to reside on. So that's why it becomes an infection, because it's so intensive it becomes an infection to that area. So that's what a virus actually does. Okay, virus is so minuscule in size, you can't even see it with your eye. Let's go to the other extreme. Let's look at an elephant, which is so gigantic. It's the largest animal on planet Earth, living on land. If you look at an elephant, see how much an elephant consumes. Huge quantities of food. There's green food, green foliage. And elephants in the forest move in herds, probably 10, 20, 30 elephants move together. And they consume extensively. They keep on eating constantly. Look at the elephants. Have you ever heard of elephants destroying forests? Never. Even though they live in forests, they eat voraciously, they keep on moving, and they never destroy a forest. So what does it say? They are extensive eaters, they are not intensive eaters. So they go extensively across the forest eating, and then they're moving. So that's what they do. And you look at the dung of an elephant, it is a lot of half digested food. So what happens? So it becomes again a rejuvenator for the forest land, for the plants to rejuvenate. So by the time an elephant goes in an elephant corridor and comes back to its place after a long period of time, that area has rejuvenated itself. So that is a contrast between a virus and an elephant. Now let us look at a man. A man is again a very intensive animal. So what he does is, he takes a place, he propagates there a lot, and he also uses up that area where that environment where he lives as in a very intensive manner, to the extent of him destroying the environment where he lives in, which is what we have done in most of the cities. So what is it? Man is actually a virus. Because if you look at the role of a virus and role of a man is so similar, that we are so intensive to the extent of destroying our environment. So when man becomes a virus to destroy the environment, it's natural for nature to hit back and virus to re-destroy man again. It's a balance of nature. And for staying alive, what's the secret? So you have to learn how to avoid this crisis by staying alive with nature, avoid crisis by being proactive with prevention to bring in methods and things. So you balance all these things. So it's all about balance at all times, all through life so that you know what's happening.
Now, if you ask, okay, so India has had such a philosophical view and such a great idea of twinning and balance, but is there something concrete that we can talk about in its whole, shall we say, mission of staying alive? Then there is a beautiful case study which we will actually have to go through very quickly, which is about vaccines.
See, if you look at it is see if you look at vaccination, we all think of vaccination as Edward Jenner who brought it in the year 1796. So the word vaccination comes from the Latin word vacca, meaning for cow. Whereas in contrast, India has had this vaccination for a long time. India has had this vaccination for a long time. Wherein you had people who are going around vaccinating people, and this is described by a person named Holwell, who writes about how people were traveling across these charakas, taking vaccination across the land and ensuring that there was no smallpox or any other plague diseases that hits the people. And this was done on a regular basis.
And Holwell, who was a doctor himself, and in 1767, much before Jenner's discovery of the vaccination, he says that India was using it, and there were no large-scale epidemics of smallpox recorded until Jenner's vaccine was introduced into India, and the Indian traditional system was banned in 1804. So only after that, India started having frequent seeing frequent occurrences of this epidemic. Similarly, in 1731, again, there has been an account. So even much before Jenner, we have been using vaccines, and there is a very clear discernment by the British themselves that it is because they stopped the ancient system but did not bring in the new system sufficiently enough in time. So what does this go to show? That it is not just the discovery of a medicine or a preventive, but a preventive by nature has discipline associated with it. There is a system also that goes with it. So it has to be practiced in a disciplined manner and as a system, wide and large, continuously, for its effect to stay as a protective armor around. The moment you break that chain, then the armor is gone and then you become vulnerable. And the record for vaccination goes back to 550 CE itself, and it was called Vasuri and Go Vasuri.
Go Vasuri is cowpox.
And again, if you see, plague was something that hit India in 1896. And before that, this was again from China because of the opium trade that the British were conducting through Hong Kong. And that's when the plague came to India. And before that, another instance of plague in India was during the wars during the invasion by Muhammad of Ghazni. And that is when plague again had come to India. But by far and large, we have not been afflicted by such epidemics because we were having a rigid system which we were maintaining with discipline. See, look at the number of deaths we have had only much later in the 1900s and so on. So disruption to such routines is what can bring in epidemics. So discipline and having a system, a widespread system, is very, very important in making sure that our protective armor stays intact without a chink. So given that, so in fact in our book, Brand Bharat Leads from India, we write about vaccine, how it was one of the brands of India, and now it is time to reclaim the brand once again, given that we have a very well proven traditional medicine system, especially one which has had a focus on preventives. And today India is a preferred partner for biotechnology, genome research. We have a very open-minded genetic engineering policy. We have a good pharma medical industry. We are a hub for clinical trials today. More than anything, we are also a very friendly nation, willing to share outcomes with others. because we have always followed, we've been guided by the principle Loka Samasta Sukhino Bhavantu. So, given all this, we are the ideal home ground for conducting such research on vaccines and sharing it with not just vaccines but many other things which lie hidden until Jenner discovered vaccination. I mean, we have been practicing, but West discovered it only in 1700s, and then that has become one major invention and a very good defense mechanism for us. Now, there could be many more such things which we had practiced, which we will have to dig up from our traditional systems and see how we can bring them out to the world for the benefit of mankind once again. Fundamentally, we have to develop confidence in India, its ethos and its ways, and we have to parallelly dare to be Indian and to follow such ethos and adopt these kind of ways to live in present times with the same kind of confidence and success that we had before.
All this we have brought out in our book called Staying Alive, an Indian Perspective, and it's available online, and details of this book and all the contents of this book is available for you in our blog, in our posts in social media, as well as in our website. I hope you enjoyed this presentation of ours on the Indian perspective of staying alive, because during this lockdown, one of the key factors that you have to keep in mind is how to stay alive. And so that's what we are doing. So just the content that we are trying to bring out in this particular book, take it forward.
So if there are any questions, then we will be happy to go through them.
So thank you so much for your time, patience, and your appreciation of this presentation of ours. Thank you.
Thank you. Namaste.